Hello everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, A Tip of the Iceberg, How Pipette Tips Influence Assay Results. I am Sue Pham of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We're delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots and sponsored by Eppendorf. Eppendorf is a leading life science company that develops and sells instruments, consumables, and services for liquid, sample, and cell handling in laboratories worldwide. For more information, please visit eppendorf.com. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the live event. You can submit questions by typing them in the green Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window, or submit your problem through the green Q&A button lower left. This is an educational webinar and thus offers free continuing education credit. After the webinar is over, please click on the CE button located on the bottom left-hand corner of your webpage and follow the process of obtaining your credits. I would like now to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ulrike Gast. Dr. Gast specializes in applications for liquid handling systems and teaching customers their correct use. She has supported several Eppendorf pipette calibration services worldwide in their accreditation process. Within the frame of development of the new guideline, which is the DKG R8-1, she was a member of the Responsive International Technical Committee of DKD, an official body for calibration solutions. The guideline defines technical requirements for the calibration of liquid handling systems and the setup of measurements and certainty budget for calibration labs. Dr. Gast holds a PhD in biology from the University of Tübingen based on a broad spectrum of methods. She has a great deal of practical experience in both the correct use of liquid handling systems and their performance testing. I will now turn it over to Dr. Gast for her presentation.
Thanks, Sue, for the nice introduction. And hello and a warm welcome to everybody from Hamburg in Germany. Within today's educative webinar, I would like to explain how tips can influence pipetting results. Our agenda looks as follows. I'm starting with a short introduction into a widely unknown problem you might face in your lab. We are then approaching the context by checking out the ISO 8655, the standard for liquid handling. After this, I'm presenting some results of a broad study we have performed. This webinar will probably bring up some question marks regarding the use of pipette tips. Thus, I do not want to end the webinar without giving recommendations before I finish with a summary. There is some time for further questions at the end of this webinar, as you know. Before we start now, I would like to make a quick poll and ask you, are you familiar with the topic of pipette tip related influences? Okay, so the results you can see on the screen now. So we have 65% saying yes, I'm familiar with tip-related influencing factors, and 35% roughly say no. Thank you very much for your vote. From time to time, Eppendorf gets calls for help like this one. we recently tested the performance of our pipettes by calibration. Being a big surprise, we found a couple of them to be out of specifications. Thus, we sent the pipettes to service for repair. However, the service sent them back with the information that they are working correctly. So what is the problem with my pipettes? Now, I checked the performance of these pipettes using the customer's setup. The calibration result was the following. This is the measurement report of the customer's pipette. As you can see on the top, he is working with an Eppendorf Research Plus 1000 microliter fixed volume pipette. Using a balance, I performed 10 measurements and all environmental data were okay. All calculations also have been proven to be correct. As you probably know, the performance of a pipette is determined by two errors. The systematic error, or also called inaccuracy, and the random error, or imprecision, called the random error. Now, in the middle block, you can see the measurement result as well as the allowed error tolerances, called limit value. Well, we see that in this case, the customer is right. The inaccuracy is exceeded. It is roughly 4 times higher than allowed. Thereby, the minus indicates that not enough volume has been aspirated and dispensed into the balance. So what is the problem here? A little detail is mentioned below the results box. Instead of Eppendorf tips, some other manufacturer tips have been used. Tips maybe from a generic tip provider. Can this be the problem? It makes sense to test the pipette again using the original Eppendorf tips. This protocol gives the result of calibrating the same pipette in the same way just a few minutes later. The only difference is the use of Eppendorf tips. If you look into the middle block, you can see that now the inaccuracy is okay. Is it magic? No, of course not. But obviously, the alternative pipette tips influence the pipetting result in a way that the error limits become exceeded. Accordingly to this finding, the ISO 8655 standard states pipette and tip to be a system. The ISO 8655 deals with piston stroke pipettes. Regarding the interaction of pipette and tips, it stipulates the error limits are valid for the whole system consisting of pipette and pipette tip. The supplier's declaration or certificate of conformity do not apply if the pipette tips are used which are not delivered by the pipette manufacturer. So in order to find out more about this context, we performed a large study including standard tips of 15 different manufacturers. We calibrated 10 microliter and 1000 microliter tips. We have already seen that tips can have an impact on the pipetting result, but the overall result of this study was rather surprising. Interestingly, it was mainly the, let's say, extreme volumes where the error limits were exceeded. 1 microliter with 10 microliter tips and 1000 microliter with 1000 microliter tips. For this reason, here I show the results of these two volumes. The imprecision is shown on the y-axis, on this axis, and the systematic error or inaccuracy is shown on the y-axis. On the x-axis. All data points within the red area are calibration results within the manufacturer's pipette specifications. Now, with Eppendorf tips, the pipetting system was within these error tolerances. In total, the system failed the calibration with 8 of 15 tip manufacturers. The calibration was repeated by a different calibrating person at a different calibration lab, but using another manufacturer pipette. And guess what? The results confirmed our findings. This indicates that the findings are not linked to a certain pipette. There are general influencing factors which evoke these results. But what are these tip-related influencing factors? Are all of these tips of bad quality? In order to solve this question, let us start with the big volume here, the 1000 microliter. For understanding the main influencing factor on bigger volumes, we need to understand that functional principle of a piston stroke pipette, a so-called air cushion pipette. In between the piston inside of the pipette and the liquid surface in the pipette tip, an air cushion exists. This air cushion can be influenced by a number of factors. On this picture you can see an Eppendorf 1000 microliter tip as it was used within the study. On the right-hand side you can now see the alternative tips that failed the calibration at 1000 microliter. Just by visual comparison you can easily see that the tips have different sizes. And different sizes mean different volumes of air cushion. Different shapes also lead to a different liquid filling level. Both factors, the air cushion size and the filling level, have been reported by literature to influence the inaccuracy. And this brings us to an important fact. By the manufacturer, pipettes become adjusted to a certain tip design, meaning they become adjusted to a certain air cushion size and liquid filling level. So if an alternative tip is used, the system may not work within allowed error tolerances just because of the tip's design. If we now look to the small pipetting volume of 1 microliter, we are facing a completely different and influencing factor. We found tips of 5 manufacturers to push the system out of the error tolerances. The air cushion size could not have caused this, since the Eppendorf 10 microliter tips have been shown to be the biggest within the study. Thus we had to search for another influencing factor. And here, the feedback from a German customer brought us on the right track. The customer complained problems with one of our manual pipettes. He found it impossible to dispense very small volumes, like 0.8 microliters, onto a solid surface. He described that sometimes a drop was created at the tip's orifice and sometimes not. He was using alternative tips, so we gave him a sample of our standard tips and he found the problem to be solved. So obviously, the influencing factor had something to do with the tip orifice. Thus, we took a closer look onto the tip of the tip. On this picture, you can see the orifice of an Eppendorf 10 microliter standard tip. It was just placed under a microscope with the orifice facing towards the ocular. The tip has a good geometry and no visible production errors. The tips failing the calibration showed an impaired geometry of the orifice by production flaws. For explaining most important production failures, I picked the following 2 examples. This example shows a flash on the exterior wall. Around here. This flash builds gaps and grooves where liquid can be retained during the dispensing. A leftover from the production, a so-called molding flash, is left within the tip. This does not only decreases the liquid volume, it also poses a risk of becoming ejected into the sample during dispensing. This example shows a noticeable core shift. If the walls of a pipette tip have a varying diameter, the water may be deflected to the side of the thinner wall. To speak in pictures, the drop jumps to the outer wall and thus is not part of the dispensing volume anymore. Yes, I'm talking about small drops and liquid remainders here, but since we are talking about very small volume, this already counts. In general, you can say that the smaller the volume, the more important a perfect geometry of the tip orifice becomes. The geometry of the tip orifice is fully influenced by the production quality. Keep in mind that the production site for pipette tips produces billions of tips per year. Thus, a high maintenance frequency of the tools as well as several quality control steps are essential in order to prevent those examples that we have just seen. Another important factor for the system's accuracy is the tip fit. This influencing factor is always important, regardless of the volume. The tip fit defines if the system becomes airtight or is leaking. A slightly leaking tip often stays undiscovered because leakage of liquid does not develop immediately after aspiration. With tips having a varying sealing quality, it becomes impossible to work reproducible. But one after the other, here comes the background. The tip fit is mainly influenced by three characteristics: position of the sealing rim, quality of the sealing rim, and production tolerances. Most pipette tips are equipped with a sealing rim. The sealing rim is a plastic rim that has the function to seal the system airtight. This sealing rim needs to be positioned within the tip that it becomes pushed onto the pipette cone during the tip attachment. If the sealing rim has a varying tip-to-tip quality, the reproducibility of the pipettings become affected. Some tips seal tightly on the cone while others evoke leakage. In order to visualize this situation, a testing prod with exact diameter was placed into 3 tips of one box of manufacturer G. We found the testing prod to stop at different positions, showing varying diameter of the sealing rim. All production sites produce according to a certain production tolerance. Such tolerances are needed in order to evaluate freshly manufactured products. Are they okay and can be sold, or are they not okay and cannot be sold? System providers, for example Eppendorf, synchronize the production tolerances of tips and pipette cone. Even if the production tolerances are maxed out, the tip still does fit onto the pipette cone. This is a service a non-system provider cannot offer. And this finding brings us to another important fact. Manufacturers of pipetting tips do not only sell pipettes and tips, they also sell the assurance that the components of the system are made in a design and quality enabling the system to perform within specified error tolerances, regardless of the tip batch. This is based on a requirement of the ISO 8655. Generic tip manufacturers do not have to prove that the performance of the system is within the error limits. Thus, they are free in defining production tolerances. Please keep in mind, the fact that a tip fits onto a pipette cone does not say anything about the tightness or the performance of the system. Compare with a coffee machine. The best coffee machine does not deliver best coffee if you choose poor coffee pads. Next, I would like to give you one last example before deducing recommendations. Can you remember the calibration protocols I showed you at the beginning of this webinar? The system was working correctly with Eppendorf tips, but it exceeded the allowed error limits for the inaccuracy when using the alternative tips. Well, this calibration was performed using one tip for all 10 measurements of the calibration. In other words, the tip was reused 10 times. In contrast, the ISO 8655 recommends to use a new tip for each individual measurement. So, let's say we repeat the calibration according to the ISO 8655 recommendation. Now we use a new tip for each measurement instead of one tip for the complete calibration. Now, please share your opinion within a quick poll. What do you think? Does the calibration result improve if 10 tips are used for the calibration instead of 1 tip? Okay, thank you for giving me the results. So roughly 60% say that the result will improve if 10 tips are used for the calibration instead of 1 tip. Instead, 40% say no, it will not improve. Now, of course, I did this calibration, and we should have a look what was the result. So when using a new tip for each measurement, the limit for inaccuracy and the imprecision was exceeded. The random error or imprecision describes deviation which are not systematically, or, with other words, deviation which occur with changing volumes like by the user, by temperatures or temperature changes, or varying tip quality. Knowing this, guess what happens if person A pipettes a reaction setup with tip change. On the next day, person B works on the same analysis but without change. So you will probably get differing results then. So obviously, with this manufacturer, we have the facts, or we have to face the facts that the tip change leads to a risen imprecision, which you can see here. So there are tips, like Eppendorf tips, where it does not matter if you perform a tip change or reuse 1 tip within a pipetting series. Just clarify by calibration if there is an influence. After I have gone through all these facts, I would like to give you some recommendations for your daily work. First of all, if possible, use pipette and tips from the same manufacturer. If you have to use alternative tips, you should check the system's performance as recommended by the ISO 8655 with a 2-step calibration. First, perform a conformity testing by calibrating the system using pipette and tips from the same manufacturer. This is to make sure that the original system is performing correctly. Then secondly, repeat the calibration using the alternative tips. Please use 1 tip per measurement for this calibration in order to uncover quality-related issues. You might have to adjust the pipette. If you have to do so, make a remark on the pipette that it has been adjusted for the use of these tips. Repeat the calibration, or at least perform a quality testing with every new batch of alternative tips. If you have to make a purchasing decision towards alternative tips, please check out the following. Check the position of the sealing rim. Does it fit onto the pipette cone? Is the tip size or the tip shape clearly different from the original tip? When using multi-channel pipettes, roll the tips over the table. Do they wobble or do they look bent? During aspiration, watch the liquid surface. Is it calm or being disturbed? Aspirate liquid very fast. Does the liquid surface break up and splash into the pipette cone? Check the orifice under the microscope for production failures or core shifts. Ask your tip supplier to certify that the tip is suitable for your pipette. Calibrate the system with and without tip change. Are the results different? Ask your tip supplier for quality control steps within production. And ask your tip supplier if the tips are free of leachables disturbing biological assays. For more information about this topic, I would like to ask you to refer to the website, because we have a leachable webinar on demand. If you look through the literature, only very few publications define the pipette and pipette tips used. This is due to the common understanding that pipettes and tips are general lab tools with minor influence on the analysis results. However, as shown here, this is only true for pipettes and tips of one manufacturer. In case of utilizing alternative tips, the system's performance may be impaired. Comparable to the findings with leachables, this can affect study results. In fact, the results may not be reproducible when using a different pipetting system. Thus, we recommend to state the pipette and tips which are used. So, up to now within this webinar, we have gone through 4 important influencing factors on pipetting results. First of all, the tip design. Secondly, quality of the tip orifice. Then we have discussed the tip fit, which is influenced by the sealing rim. And finally, the tip change or no tip change, so it's a methodical influence. There are much more influencing factors existing, but being less important. Thus, I would call these ones the big 4. However, you can break them down into 2 categories: design or shape-related influencing factors and quality-related influencing factors. In general, tip-related influencing factors are like an iceberg. You can see only 20% with a bare eye. Tips falling off the cone are one example. The other 80% stay undetected if the system does not become calibrated. An example is the design-related influence on air cushion size. So if using alternative tips, keep in mind that it is impossible to conclude from tip fit to the system's performance. Summarizing the content of today's webinar, I would like to point out 4 facts. We have seen that pipette tips can impair pipetting results, regardless of the pipette used. This might be surprising since pipette tips are single-use items. The ISO 8655 standard regards the pipette and tip to be a system. Accordingly, system manufacturers produce all parts of the system to fit to each other. This ensures best performance. Furthermore, by the manufacturer, pipettes become adjusted to a certain tip design. If you need to use alternative tips, we strongly recommend to calibrate the system. In documentations and publications, the used liquid handling system should be named. And finally, always choose your tips with the same care as you choose your pipette. So with this picture, I would like to finish the webinar. If you wish to go into further details, please feel free to download the application note 354 from the Appendorf website. And now I'm handing over to Soon, and I'm very curious for your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gast, for that presentation. It was really wonderful. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind the audience of how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can today. So the first question that we have, the participant asks, I'm not using the original pipette tips. What do I have to do in detail to make sure that the system is performing well?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Let this answer to be a little bit longer since you asked for the details. First of all, you should define the accuracy and requirement of your pipette. If you are using it only for aspirating supernatants, there might be no requirements in terms of inaccuracy and precision. In contrast, if you are using the pipette for quality defining steps, you should define the performance of the system. We recommend doing this according to ISO 8655. In the first step, you do a performance testing using the original tips. This is a full calibration with 10 measurements, each at 3 volumes. First the nominal volume, then the 50% of nominal volume, and 10% of the nominal volume. On our website, we offer a standard operating procedure for further instructions on how to calibrate the system of Eppendorf pipettes and tips. If the system is working within the manufacturer error limit for inaccuracy and imprecision, you proceed to step 2. You repeat the calibration utilizing the alternative tips. Please make sure that you use the new tip for each individual measurement. You can now receive 3 possible results. First, the system is within the error limits. Then the system can be used right away. Second, the systematic error or inaccuracy is exceeded. In this case, you need to adjust the pipette to the alternative tips. Do not forget to make a mark on the pipette that it has been adjusted to the alternative tips. Third, the random error, also called the imprecision, exceeds the error limits. In this case, I would not recommend using these tips. Pipettes cannot be adjusted to the random error because it is based on varying deviation of results. Within this setup, this is a clear indicator for varying tip-to-tip quality. Furthermore, if you use alternative tips, we recommend calibrating the system with each new batch of tips. So I hope this answers your question more in detail.
That was great, thank you. Next, one participant says, I have to autoclave my tips. Do I have to expect impact on the accuracy and precision of those tips?
The answer is yes. We have shown within the study that the performance of some tips was influenced by autoclaving. What you can do to find out is performing a calibration according to the ISO 8655 as just explained. So first check the system using the original tips and then repeat the calibration with the autoclaved alternative tips.
Great, thank you. And then if tips have such great influence on pipetting results, why don't you sell a closed system?
Wow, this is an interesting question. Thanks for that. We want to give the customer all possibilities. So not all tips on the market are poor or not suitable. So there are good tips on the market without any discussion. However, if you decide for other tips, it is up to you to make sure that the system performs well. And you can do this by checking the tips and calibrate the system.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Okay. So.
Okay, next we have a question from Arden. What is the acceptable calibration frequency for automatic pipettes?
What was the question again?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The the question, I have a different question now. The participant says, I have read that pipetting liquids of different temperatures can greatly influence pipetting accuracy. What is your recommendation for when aspirating low volumes of cold liquids?
Okay, thank you. So this is a general topic we have to address in the lab, so that has nothing to do with the tip itself. There we have to think of it, in a different way, because here I would call it a problematic liquid actually. The temperature also is an influencing factor on the pipetting results. It is an influencing factor actually on the air cushion size. So what you can do is, opportunity one would be to cool everything down. But this is something you will probably not like to do, because you need to cool down the lab and the whole system, so the tips, the pipette, the lab, and the liquid, and you don't want to use that or to do that. So the other recommendation we can give would be to use a positive displacement principle. So step away of the air cushion principle to the positive displacement principle. So there are devices which can be used, and with these devices the piston is within the tip, and the liquid will come into contact with the piston, and then you do not have the air cushion. Generally speaking, the cold temperature liquids is not only a problem for small volumes, but for all volumes actually. So that's a general recommendation.
Fantastic. Okay. We'll leave some time for more questions to come in if you want to look at them.
Hang on, yeah.
Okay. Next, we have a question from Adriana, who asks, if the calibration is performed with low retention tips, how may the data change?
Yeah, okay. In general, low retention tips are tips with a special surface. So the surface is modified on a molecular level, so there is no additive on it, but it's modified on the molecular level. And this leads to the fact that it is ultra-hydrophobic. And it was brought to market because so many users in the lab were working with detergent-containing liquids. And these detergent-containing liquids have the not-so-nice habit that they stick to the pipette tip surface. And with these ultra-hydrophobic surface, they will become ejected in the same way as water. But as I said, the surface is ultra-hydrophobic. So the question is, does that make any influence on the pipetting result? And to our, it's not part of our study, but we made, of course, some research on that, and we found out that with the bigger volumes it's no problem, but with a smaller volume it makes a difference. So with small volumes I would definitely not work with water, because in a calibration you normally use water. The reason is that the ratio of surface to volume is different in small volume tips than to bigger volume tips. So to summarize that long answer, so with bigger volume tips it will probably not make any difference, but with the small volume tips I do not recommend to use low retention tips with water.
That's very informative. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. If there are no more questions, actually there's one more. from Tagaki, who says, do you have any recommendations of how often we should recalibrate? Once a year, every 6 months?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when talking about tip batches, as I said in the presentation, I do recommend to calibrate every new tip batch when using alternative tips. Regarding the system itself, meaning also the pipette, it belongs a little bit to your work. So the ISO standard says that the system should be calibrated at least once a year, but it does also say that you can amend or make shorter or higher frequency in order to suit to your lab work. So, for example, if you're working or if you use the pipette or the liquid handling system in a quality-related analysis step, you should probably calibrate a little bit more often than just once a year. I know from a lot of pharmaceutical based or industry-based labs, especially if customers working under regulations or in regulated fields, that they do the calibrations much more often, like once a quarter of a year, so every 3 months, for example. So it belongs a little bit to the number of users, to the requirements you have in the accuracy of the pipette, to the chemicals that you use. So there's a lot of factors that play a role here. Sorry, I cannot give a very clear answer to that. So you really have to estimate looking from the experiments that you do, actually.
Very, very informative. Thank you. Okay, at this time, I'd like to ask another question. The question is from Levy, who says, when I aspirate liquid quickly and it splashes inside the cone, how do you prevent that?
Okay, yeah, I have come across this problem with some alternative tips, actually. So with that tips, I found out that you have to pipe it very, very slowly at the first 2 to 3 millimeters. So when the liquid rises in the tip, the first 2 to 3 millimeters, you have to be very slow. After that, you can be a little bit faster. In general, regarding a good pipetting technique, you should pipette slowly anyway. But with some, I know these situations, for example, you want to calibrate and you want to pre-wet your pipette tip before the calibration, and you have to do this pre-wetting 5 times, and you want to go into the calibration, so you want to be fast there, and yeah, then this can happen. So always be very, very slow with your pipetting and moving the operating button.
Good advice. Thank you. If we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Gast again for such a wonderful presentation. It was very informative. Do you have any final comments for us before we go? Okay. I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Gast, as well as our sponsor, Eppendorf, for making today's educational web seminar possible. Today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through November of 2016. You will receive an email from LabRoots alerting you when this webcast is available for replay. We invite you to forward this announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.